Hello, YouTube. We live now in very strange times when destinies of nations can be decided. And the ongoing Russian-Ukrainian war could lead to unexpected and unforeseen consequences. And once in a while, I bring you very interesting stories about what you could call dark secrets of the Russian Empire. And I think the more people know about them, the better, because Russia is the largest country on the planet. And what happens there impacts everyone. So today I want to tell you the story of Russia's most mysterious emperor, a very interesting person about whose final days actually we don't know all that maybe we should. But let me explain. Let me start this way. The eldest son of Grand Duke Paul Petrovich, or Pavel Petrovich, later Emperor Paul I. Alexander was born in St. Petersburg in 1777. Paul's mother, Catherine the Great, the promiscuous empress, utterly disliked her son and did not think him capable of ruling the country. When Alexander, her first and long-awaited grandson, was born, Catherine saw him as her successor and took control of his education. Catherine wanted to mold Alexander into an enlightened and cosmopolitan monarch. Brought up in the free-thinking spirit of her court, the young prince was well versed in European culture, history, and politics. But bitter hatred between Paul and Catherine, or Ekaterina, forced him to play two different roles. At court, Alexander adhered to the principle of human rights and civil liberties, enjoyed the arts, opera, and philosophy. At his father's residence, he embraced strict military discipline and endless drills. Alexander soon turned into a natural chameleon, becoming secretive and easily changing his views and conduct to fit the circumstances. Catherine's death in 1796 brought Alexander's father, Paul I, to the throne, but he wasn't to reign for a long time. Widely unpopular among the nobility, 5 years later, Paul fell victim of a coup. Historians still debate Alexander's role in his father's murder. It is believed that he gave the plot his tacit approval, but didn't think that things would go beyond abdication. The news of the murder terrified him. Guilt and remorse would haunt him for the rest of Alexander's life. Alexander's last years were filled with obsession with God and Christianity. At the end of his reign, he was a troubled man, crushed, in his own words, beneath the terrible burden of the crown. In the autumn of 1825, on a trip to the south of Russia, Alexander caught a cold which developed into typhoid. So he died in the southern city of Taganrog in November of 1825, and he was buried at the Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg. But his sudden death caused persistent rumors that the Tsar secretly abdicated and became a monk. A legend has it that a mysterious hermit, Fyodor Kuzmich, who appeared in Siberia in 1836, was in fact Alexander I. When the Soviet government opened his coffin in the 1920s, it was found empty. And I will add more details as we proceed, because it's a very complicated story in itself. The strange quick death of the emperor, which occurred in 1925 in Taganrog, caused a lot of rumors and speculations. Many believe that Alexander, all his life feeling guilty for indirect participation in the death of his father Paul I, simply left the throne simulating his death. There were numerous gossips and rumors that arose within a few weeks after Alexander's death. One of the rumors in particular states that the sovereign fled undercover to Kiev, and there he will live in Christ with his soul and will begin to give advice that the present sovereign Nikolai Pavlovich needs for better government. And later, in the 1930s, 1940s, a legend appeared that it was Emperor Alexander who was hiding in the city of Tomsk, that's in Siberia, far from the capital, under the name of Elder Fyodor Kuzmich. The elder Fyodor Kuzmich, having lived a long, pious life, died in 1864 and was buried in Siberia. And the grave in the Peter and Paul Cathedral, according to legend, remained empty the same year, since the body of the emperor's double buried in it was secretly removed from there. In Fyodor Kuzmich, one could really recognize the former emperor. He was stately, tall, and blue-eyed. According to the stories, he received famous guests and talked to them in a foreign language, most likely in French. Moreover, sometimes the elder shared amazing stories, up to what was in the emperor's thoughts. He said that during the prayer to Saint Sergius of Radonezh, the Lord instructed Alexander I to appoint Kutuzov as commander-in-chief during the War of 1812. This is when France invaded Russia under Napoleon. In Siberia, Fyodor Kuzmich had a pupil, a girl named Sashenka. Consequently, the girl sent her on a pilgrimage and made her route with such subtlety that it was beyond the power of an ordinary pious hermit. By an amazing coincidence, at the same time, Sashenka and Emperor Nicholas I himself were in the same place. The girl was introduced to the emperor, and during their long conversation, she told a lot about life in Siberia, and especially about Fyodor Kuzmich. The elder tried not to write anything. Before he died, he even burned some papers. Only 2 narrow tapes of notes remained in his bag. They still cannot be deciphered. And I want to tell you something, that we're talking about events of such a long time ago, but the mystery around his death is still something which I don't want to call classified, but let's say that the vaults are not being opened. In addition, the originals of the notes have not been preserved. There are only old photocopies of them. The same story is with the envelope, which was signed either by him or someone else. The elder never answered questions about his past. But Siberia of that time was full of various people, including high-ranking people in the past, and some of them who saw the emperor in the capital city really recognized him now in Fyodor Kuzmich. In 1864, when the dying elder was asked to give his name and confession, he only answered, "God knows that." When someone fell on his knees in front of him and asked if he was a former Russian autocrat, emperor, Fyodor Kuzmich meekly replied, "Your deeds are wonderful, Lord. The secret will always be revealed." This is what he said. This legend was very popular among the common people, and the Bolsheviks, the communists, who took over the former Russian Empire and caused so much grief to its population, in order to prove that there are no good kings or emperors or autocrats, in 1921 decided to open the grave. But the emperor's sarcophagus really turned out to be empty. There is no documentary evidence of this autopsy, at least in the public domain, but this is not surprising. It is unlikely that the Soviet government, having suffered such a propaganda collapse, would advertise it. To prove or disprove the legend of the empty tomb of Alexander I, historians several times, starting from the 1930s, repeatedly petitioned for the opening of the grave, but each time they were refused. I proved 30 years ago that the elder is the Emperor Alexander I, said Viktor Fyodorov, a Tomsk writer whose book, Proof of Identity, about the vanished emperor, already passed, I think, 4 editions. Now, he is firmly convinced of his correctness. Back in 1989, the historian Tabuzov from Novosibirsk gave this review to my work. The proof can be considered sound although the documents cited are difficult to verify. So double check. You have so many archives and sources. After all, I have reworked more than 20 volumes on Alexander I, several dozen articles and books on the elder. I have more than 100 indirect proofs, and four direct ones in my book. I don't need expertise. Meanwhile, Viktor Ivanovich's confidence is not shared by eminent historians, and Fyodorov believes that they are afraid for their ranks and titles. If we examine the DNA of the saint, because since 1984 he was included in the Cathedral of Siberian Saints, that only in comparison with the samples of Alexander I's mother, Empress Maria Feodorovna, after all, Alexander I's father, Paul I, himself suspected that the children might not be from him. So there is the question of the paternity of the vanished emperor. At the same time, Fyodorov is sure that the relics in the Tomsk monastery belong to Fyodor Kuzmich. But from a purely scientific point of view, questions may arise here. In 1903, a chapel was built on the site of the elder's grave. When they began to dig the foundation, the burial was partially opened, and in 1936, the chapel was destroyed. That's in Stalin's times. Apparently, the grave was damaged. Our art critic told me that the local communist gave the skull of the elder to the children to play. It's an event that almost happened, but that's what they said. According to Fyodorov, according to another hypothesis, the skull was taken to Moscow. Where it was then placed is unknown. Anyway, the skull of the saint has been lost, and it is impossible to restore its exact appearance now. At that time, there were garages on the site of the chapel. Viktor Ivanovich Fyodorov continues the story. Some write that there was almost a toilet there. That's not so. As you know, the distance between the garages is small. Into those cracks, they ran to empty themselves, to relieve themselves. At least I didn't see any public toilet there. In the 1990s, the garages were demolished. During the excavations, a coffin without a lid was found under them, and in it, the remains without a skull. Now there is a chapel on this place again, and the relics of the saint are in the Kazan church of the monastery. Fyodorov is convinced that these are the remains of Fyodor Kuzmich, and does not want to admit that from the point of view of science, this is not obvious. Well, Empress Elizaveta Alexeyevna died or disappeared after her husband in 1826. According to one hypothesis, she later appeared under the name of Vera the Silent, Vera Molchalnitsa, hermit of the Cirkov monastery. An interesting coincidence is that both Vera the Silent and Fyodor Kuzmich appeared almost simultaneously, with a difference of 2 years. She appeared in 1834 and he in 1836. And despite the clearly high aristocratic origin of both of them, as indicated by everyone who communicated with them, no facts about the previous life of these two were known. In the notes of the last empress, Alexandra Fyodorovna, we're speaking about the last Romanovs, there is an indication that one day after the February Revolution, that's in 1917, she was engaged in burning papers with the initials F and TO. The only person who could be related to the last Romanovs and had such initials was the elder Fyodor Kuzmich. For what reasons the last emperor and empress did not want to officially recognize the identity of Fyodor Kuzmich and Alexander I is unknown. There are many secrets related to Russian monarchy, and I've mentioned some, and will mention more. It's really a fascinating history, very unusual. The greatest researcher of the mystery of the Siberian elder was the Grand Duke Nikolai Mikhailovich, a biographer of Alexander I. He, by his own admission, at first treated this legend with great distrust, but after a research conducted in Siberia, he changed his point of view. Nikolai Mikhailovich sent a trusted official to Siberia who interviewed local residents who knew the elder and then conducted a comparative analysis of the remaining handwriting samples of the emperor and Fyodor Kuzmich. He systematized the collected information and published it in 1907 in the book The Legend of the Death of Emperor Alexander I in Siberia, in the image of elder Fyodor Kuzmich. Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich reported that in 1916, Nikolai Mikhailovich asked Emperor Nicholas II for permission to publish new results of his research, but received a refusal from the latter. At the same time, Nikolai II did not deny the reality of the existing legend, but he categorically did not want to make it public. Nicholas II himself, while still the heir, once came to bow to the elder's grave during his trip to Siberia. It is also known that in the inscription on the grave cross, the whole body of the great elder Fyodor Kuzmich is buried here. The heir ordered to add the word blessed, which for many was unambiguously associated with Alexander I. The fact is that back in 1814, for the victory over Napoleon and the organization of the anti-French coalition, the Senate bestowed on Alexander I the title of Blessed Magnanimous Restorer of Powers. This hypothesis is supported by the fact that Nicholas I, while sorting through the archives of the family, burned most of the papers of the late Empress Elizaveta Alexeyevna, including her detailed diaries for the period from 1792 to 1826. If you deny the legend about the planned secret departure of the royal couple from power, then it is very difficult to find any rational grain in this. And, sometimes it's hard to find rational grain in the Russian history. And I'm not here to belittle the Russian people because you can't blame the entire people of a nation for things that are done by those in power who are either not elected or are elected in a most interesting way, so to say. And of course, I do not wish for Russia to fall apart. I wish it to be free, democratic country. It has great resources and people with great energy. And I know, especially in Siberia, I will be honest, I think they're very different from other parts of Russia. But it has a very interesting history, and we don't know that much about it because there are rumors that the history was rewritten in the 18th century. But let's continue. A handsome man who managed to change the existing order, carry out the reforms necessary for the country, Alexander I made his contribution to the development of the Russian Empire. And first of all, his changes were the step that gradually began to blur the line between the nobility and ordinary people who do not have titles, high ranks, and large fortunes. Although Alexander had a string of lovers and 9 illegitimate children, he did not leave an heir. His 2 daughters from his marriage to Louis of Baden died young. The throne was left to Alexander's brother Nicholas I. To his contemporaries, Alexander was a riddle that each read differently. A man of the world, an actor wearing many masks, even a madman, as was gossiped, a madman who had to be humored. For some, he was a man of grand qualities, while others described him as a suspicious and undecided. one of the most extraordinary Russian monarchs. He went down into Russia's history as Alexander the Blessed, the man who didn't want to be the king or Tsar, and who led Russia to one of its greatest triumphs, victory over Napoleon, of course, and who became a legend after death. And we still do not know why. I repeat myself, those secret files are inaccessible. Files about an emperor who lived 200 years ago. So this is what I wanted to tell you today, and I'll bring you other tales of the Russian monarchy as well. And if you like my research and you can support me, you will find how to do it in the description to this video. I really appreciate your attention to my work, and I ask that you subscribe to my channel and like my videos and tell others about my channel. Thank you very much.